Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you guys all had a chance to vote today. Thank you all for joining us for what promises to be a wonderful conversation with truly accomplished writer Madeline Miller. Madeline's first novel, The Song of Achilles, was awarded the 2012 Orange Prize for Fiction, making her the fourth debut novelist to win the prize, and she was a New York Times bestseller. Madeline was also shortlisted for the 2012 Stonewall Writer of the Year. Her second novel, Circe, was a #1 New York Times bestseller and won the Indies' Choice Best Adult Fiction of the Year award. And it's currently being adapted for a series with HBO Max. As many of you know, her novels have captivated readers worldwide with their fresh perspectives on classical mythology. They're celebrated not only for their beautiful lyrical prose, but also for how they deepen our connection with these age-old stories, reminding us that myth is as much about the present as it is about the past. Madeline's background in classics, combined with her talent for storytelling, allows her to weave rich characters who resonate with readers across generations. Reading the Rainbow is a UNH book club dedicated to reading queer and BIPOC stories. Founded by Clarissa Gowing, Joy Willie, and Liberty Larman in 2021, our club is new, yet we maintain a high and active membership. Though they have graduated, thank you so much to Clarissa, Joy, and Liberty for being instrumental in planning this event. We do have Clarissa here joining with us, who was our president last year. Um, if you want to say hi, Clarissa, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I haven't done Zoom in a while. Thank you, Emma. And thank you to UNH Classics for making this event possible and for everyone who supported the book sale last year that also contributed to making this event happen. This is like one of the things that I am most proud of contributing to. And I am so glad that we could make this happen. So thank you everyone who has supported this event. And yeah, everyone enjoy. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Clarissa. She's done such great work for Reading the Rainbow. All of them have, so we appreciate them so much. So thank you for joining us, Clarissa. Um, and my name is Emma McGuire. I am one of the current presidents as well. I'm joined by Emma Schmidl-Gagney, our other president, Grace Magan, our vice president, and then I was also with Susie Doobie, our treasurer, and then Katie Shine couldn't be here with us in person, but she is our secretary and she's visiting with us virtually. And like Clarissa mentioned, we are also joined by the UNH Classics Department, who was gracious enough to help us fund this event. We will have around 45 minutes of Q&A dedicated to literature-based questions from Reading the Rainbow members, and then we'll transition to an additional 45 minutes of Q&A with the Classics Department, moderated by Jack Worth and Jillian Robinson-Warren. Reading the Rainbow has asked members to submit questions prior to this event, but we'll open up the last 15 minutes or so for live audience. So for the month of October, our members read and discussed Circe, diving into Madeline Miller's fresh storytelling. So we are so thrilled to have Madeline here today to share her insights into her writing process, her love for mythology, and how she crafts stories that continue to inspire. Please join me in welcoming Madeline Miller.
Hello. I am
Hello,
so
Madeline.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I am so grateful that all of you, particularly on this very high energy, high tension day, are here with me, thank you. There's nowhere I would rather be right now than speaking to all of you. I wish that my college had had a club like Reading the Rainbow when I had been there. It would have made my life a lot better in many, many ways. So I'm so glad that it exists. Thank you to all of you who've done this work to allow me to be here. Thank you to the classics department. I love the alliance that's happening. It's just all great. I couldn't be happier about being here. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're all so excited. We discussed Circe last Wednesday, and so I know a lot of people really love the book. So they're all really excited to be here to engage, ask some questions, especially on, the election day, kind of keep our mind off of all the anxiety that a lot of us have right now. So we're super excited. So we'll get right into the questions. Our first question is from Evie, and they say that they absolutely love Circe and that mythology is a really amorphous source to draw from. How did you choose which myths to incorporate and which versions of those stories, and how did you go about weaving, pun intended, them into a singular narrative?
Thank you for that question. So, I really learned a lot from writing The Song of Achilles, which was my first novel, in terms of how I wanted to work with the myths. And it was really different the way I did it for my first novel than the way I did it for Circe, because part of what I was really interested in with Circe is I was interested in the fact that Circe's story is really buried under kind of two layers. The first layer is just the male heroic tradition that she's most, canonically known from her appearance in the Odyssey. And, because this is an epic story and it focuses on the story of Odysseus, and she's the obstacle and he's the hero, and, he sort of has to overcome and tame her and all that stuff. So she's kind of, she has to play her role within the male heroic tradition. But then she's actually buried under a secondary layer of the story, which is that we get her story through Odysseus's own words in the Odyssey, that everything that we hear about her is actually him telling some people that he's trying to impress what happened. And so the more I thought about that and the more I kind of, read that section in the Odyssey over and over again, the more I thought, well, who is Odysseus? He's the great liar of ancient Greek literature. He's constantly, massaging his own PR. He's always trying to burnish his own reputation, make himself look good. We shouldn't believe a word he says necessarily. And so part of what I wanted to do with Circe was I love writing very close to the material because I am a classicist by training. And so I love sort of really getting to be in conversation with the material. But I also loved sort of Circe saying, okay, Odysseus, you've had, 3,000 years to tell your version of the story. Here's my version of the story, and I'm going to get to speak it. So I was enjoying the tension between sort of interacting with the myth, but also contradicting the myth in ways where I sort of was able to have Circe's perspective. I also allowed my novelist self, when I was writing Song of Achilles, my novelist self and my classic self sometimes felt like they were in conflict. That I would feel like, oh no, but I have to put that in because I would put it in if I were writing an academic paper about this. And my novelist self would be arguing, yeah, but it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit. It doesn't work. And finally, I was able to kind of give myself permission to, I have to choose what serves the story. And of course, there's a long tradition of that in classics that, the ancients were constantly retelling these stories and choosing the parts that they wanted to tell and changing the parts that they didn't like or making a new narrative. So I wasn't doing anything new there in giving myself that permission. But really, it was always the parts that, I went where the heat was for me. I knew that there were kind of four basic myths that I really wanted to touch on when I was writing about Circe. I knew I wanted to touch on the myth with the Minotaur, because she is the aunt of the Minotaur in a lot of mythology. I knew I wanted to have her meet Medea, her niece. I knew that
Sorry
I
about
wanted,
that.
no, that's fine. I knew that I wanted to obviously have the Odyssey there. And then I knew that I wanted to touch on the Telegony, which is sort of this lost epic, but that deals with her son. So those were kind of the four pieces that I knew I wanted. And then there were other bits as well. But there were plenty of myths I left out just because they didn't speak to me. I mean, there's a whole myth about Circe turning this guy into a woodpecker. It wasn't interesting to me. I had nothing about it that resonated with me, so I just left it out. Whereas there were other moments where I found a little detail in the source material, like this random mention of her arming her son with a stingray tail spear. And all of a sudden, like all my novelist brain lit up. And I was like, yeah, but it's not just, any stingray. It's like the Lord of all stingrays at the bottom of the ocean. She's got to go down to and I sort of like then created this whole scene around this very small mention, including inventing, a whole god that's not really there. So I always use the material as my jumping off point, as my touchstone, but I also give myself permission to go where the story is leading me.
That's awesome. And I feel like that permission to allow you to go where the story is taking you is exactly what mythology is all about, and so much of like the rich history from it as well. So that's great insight. Thank you. Our second question is from Victoria, and she asks, what is your writing process like? And what advice do you have for young writers who are interested in the traditional publishing route?
Mm, mm. Wow, those are two very big questions. So I love thinking about human psychology and motivation and what makes us do the things that we do and what drives us and what makes us who we are. And so whenever I look at the mythology, I think my first step is always to dig into that psychology. And I would say that the ancient myths oftentimes imply psychology, but they aren't, we just aren't usually getting kind of the Hamlet soliloquy of characters. Sometimes we do, particularly in Greek tragedy. But when we're looking at, the Iliad and the Odyssey, oftentimes we have implied psychology, but we don't really get to live inside a character. And so I'm always thinking about sort of how can I think about this if this were real? Let's take this world as real. So for example, as I was thinking about Circe, one of the details, and this kind of connects to my last answer, one of the details in the Odyssey is this description of Circe as speaking like a human. And I was really interested in that because I thought, well, what does that mean to speak like a human? And then I thought, well, what does it mean to speak like a god? And then I thought about all the times in the ancient material that gods speak to humans and how it's this overwhelming force. When a god speaks to a human, in ancient texts, your blood runs cold and your hair stands on end, and sometimes you fall to your knees, and it's this sort of physically shaking experience. And I thought, okay, so Circe doesn't speak like that. She speaks like one of us, but she grows up among beings that do speak like that. So what would that mean for her? And I thought, well, the gods value power above all. That would mean she would be an outcast and she'd be kind of caught between these two worlds. And so just taking that one detail, I started sort of thinking, well, what does that mean for her psychology? What does that mean for her family relationships? And kind of moving out from there. My writing process is extremely messy. I spend the first 5 years of both my novels kind of wandering in the wilderness, and writing and throwing away and writing and throwing away. And what I'm really listening for is I'm sort of listening for the character's voice to finally break through. And I don't really know I'm kind of flailing, but I'm listening. And finally, at some point, I write a sentence that really feels like, yes, that's the character's voice. And once I have that, then I can sort of go from there. I do tons of editing. I'm a huge editor. But I also try to give myself big freedom to, experiment and try new things and then go back and rip those things to shreds and rewrite them and rewrite them. I do write in order. Sometimes I have ideas for scenes that are coming, but I don't write them out of order because for me, psychology is everything. So I have to I don't know who Circe is in chapter 19 until I've written chapter 18. I have to kind of bring her through that process. I want to draw that character arc. I can't write with music or anywhere around people. I write in preferably a darkened room alone in silence, because I'm trying to conjure the vision in front of me. A lot of my writing was really influenced by being a theater director for many years. And so I'm picturing the scene on the stage. I'm imagining it, but also I'm kind of imagining myself in the scene at the same time. It's kind of like method writing a little bit. So all that is going on with my writing. Now, in terms of traditional publishing, um, I would say what you want is you want to get your writing as far as you can possibly take it on your own. And that includes having one or two readers that you really trust. They don't necessarily, and I think that's really key, is having a few people or even just one person whose taste you really trust and who understands what you're trying to do and can support you. They don't have to be another writer. One of my best early readers, who continues to read my work today, was another theater director. He knew a lot about storytelling, and I trusted his taste, and he knew what I was doing, and so I trusted him to always give me feedback that would kind of move me forward. I would, in general, recommend not showing your work to too many people early on. Just because for me, writing is a little bit like a bubbling pot, and you want to keep that lid on to keep the steam and the heat in there. And every time you take the lid off to show it to somebody, it kind of lets out some of that excitement. So, I try to keep it to one or two people only who see it in an early version. So once you and whoever your early reader have gotten it as far as you can get, then it's time to look for an agent. And this is really where you want to have a great agent. It's so important. Your agent is your champion. They are going to help you with all the stuff that you are going to be facing as you move into the world of traditional publishing. I love the book Before and After the Book Deal by Courtney Maum. It wasn't out when I was going through this with Song of Achilles. I wish it had been. It has a lot of really practical advice. And I even learned some things when I read it. So it's great. It's called Before and After the Book Deal. Don't be afraid of rejection. I sent out 80 letters to agents. I got 78 rejections, but luckily one of the yeses that I heard was from one of the top agents I was so hoping to work with, and she ended up being my agent. She's amazing, Julie Bearer. And she has just been with me on this whole journey. So getting a good agent is really, really key, because they can help you find the right editor for your work, and they can make sure that they're, all that stuff is moving smoothly along. There is a huge amount of luck. There's a huge amount of luck in this process. And so what you can do is do the part you can do, which is writing the best work you can and finding the best agent you can, but also knowing that, there is a lot of luck involved, and that's hard, and it can be really heartbreaking.
Yeah, that's definitely helpful for I know a lot of our members are interested in writing and publishing and all of that. So that's super insightful advice for a lot of us. Um, we
Good luck
also
and don't
have,
give up.
I'm sorry.
I said good luck and don't give up.
I know that's like the one overarching theme, right? I understand there's so many rejections, so that is, I'm sure, a lot very hopeful for a lot of us knowing that you had 78 rejections, but now you're such a successful author who written amazing books. So that is, I'm certainly a sign for a lot of us to keep going. So we have another question from an anonymous member. What is your favorite Greek myth, and do you have a certain favorite part of your novel, Circe?
Oh, what a good question. I mean, there's so many Greek myths that I love. I could just nerd out about Greek myths literally all night. I mean, the two that I wrote books about are definitely up there, because you have to love the story that you're writing about so much that even after you've read it for the thousandth time, moving where your commas are, you still connect to the story. So obviously the story of Achilles and Patroclus in the Iliad, the story of Circe. But there's so many women's stories that I love from Greek mythology. I mean, I've always loved the story of Cassandra, and maybe loved is the wrong word. I feel it's so heartbreaking and devastating, and really just reaches across the centuries in terms of how women have been ignored and their voices have been silenced, and they, all of that is, I find, deeply gripping and resonant. I I love Cassandra's story. Hector and Andromache, Philoctetes is one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite characters. I had to really discipline myself from putting him in more in my books. Um, I love the tragedy about him, Sophocles' Philoctetes. I find it deeply, deeply moving. Um, and so, yes, I'll stop there. But I mean, so many.
There are so many. I took a classical literature class over last semester, and it's sometimes it's overwhelming how many different mythologies there are and stories there are for sure. Um, But to close things off before we open up the floor for any live questions, I know many people are interested about updates about the novel that you're working on, Persephone. I'm not sure how much you can tell us about that, but Monique specifically mentions that as a woman, she relates to Circe and how people villainize her isolation. Circe's inner monologue was so beautifully well done, and she's curious if you can give us any insight into how Persephone's monologue will look like.
Mm. I would love insight into Persephone's monologue as well. I am in the flailing stage, but that's normal for me. So I'm just accepting that. And I am gonna mostly keep the pot on keep the lid on the pot. But I will say that I think that Persephone's story for a long time I don't know if intimidated is the right word, but I was wary of approaching her story because it has been told so many times. It is and it's so interesting because to me it's kind of the ultimate example of a myth, of how myths are like kaleidoscopes, right? Is that you look at it one way and it says one thing, and then you turn it slightly and it means something else and it looks completely different. You turn it a little bit more and you turn. There's so many different ways you can look at that core triangle in the center of the Persephone story: Demeter, Hades, and Persephone. And so many different brilliant writers and thinkers have approached that story in different ways. And I I also find it an interesting story because it's usually the first myth that people encounter because it's the myth of the seasons. And so it's oftentimes the one that we teach to children. Like kids encounter it. There are all kinds of children's retellings of Persephone, and I always read them whenever I see one because I find it so interesting to see, like, how are you going to deal with this extremely traumatic story in a children's book? Because there are so many deeply disturbing themes. I mean, one of the core pieces of this is your parent cannot save you. And so, that's really interesting that we're, so I think it's, to me, it's so interesting to think about how that story has been received and how it has resonated in so many different ways. And so it wasn't one that I thought I would want to write about. I was actually working on a different novel. And then all of a sudden I sort of had this lightning bolt where I was like, oh, I suddenly see what I want to say about Persephone. So I'm not going to say what that thing is because I'm still kind of teasing it out and working it all out. But I am loving being immersed in the story and really excited to work on it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Super exciting. I know a lot of us are definitely anticipating to see what you do with Persephone. So I know we'll be on the lookout for all of that. Um, but I think we'll try to move on to some questions from the audience or from the Zoom chat right now. So we'll open up the floor to anyone here in the auditorium or anyone on our YouTube live or on our Zoom live. Now is the time to ask questions. We have some additional questions that we can ask if anyone's too scared to ask a question now, but now is the time. Yeah. The question was, is there a book that you're reading right now?
Oh, what a good question. There is always a book that I'm reading right now. I do a lot of rereading. So uh, recently, I've actually been so I've been reading a lot of YA and middle grade books because I'm reading with my kids. So I've been reading a lot of those. Um, I was recently, what did I just finish? Uh, whenever anyone asks me this question, my brain just immediately wipes. So I apologize. I'm going to look on my desk. What do I have here? Oh, yes. I just started She Who Became the Sun, which I'm really excited about. And came highly, highly recommended. I am also rereading again the Aeneid, which I'm always rereading. I'm always rereading the Aeneid. That's kind of this foundational text for me. I was also thinking I was been reading a lot of poetry recently. Um, and I just kind of get my old Norton anthology out sometimes. I oftentimes like to start every writing day with a poem. And I have a bunch of poetry collections that I pull out and read that are really meaningful to me as well. So yeah. But the next up that I just started was She Who Became the Sun.
That's so cool that you're reading She Who Became the Sun because that was actually one of the our book picks a few
Oh,
years ago. So, yeah.
well, how was it? I heard it's great.
I don't know if anyone here read it because I think most people we read it like most people graduated already. Did anyone read that here? Oh, Maddie, what did you think of it? Oh, okay. She said she's reading it today.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we can have our own book club.
Exactly. That's so cool.
We have a question from the YouTube stream that is there any advice you would give to someone who's writing a novel right now?
Sorry, say that again. You cut out a little bit, or maybe
Is
Emma could
there,
repeat it.
is there any advice you could give to someone that's currently writing a novel?
Any advice I could give to someone who, I'm so sorry, I don't know why it's coming through
Amazing.
weird, or maybe you could type it in the chat.
Oh no, you're good. I will type it in the chat as well. Um, any advice for people who are currently writing a novel?
Ah, yes. Okay. So my advice is to um accept that there are times. So first of all, every writer has their own way. There's some writers who absolutely faithfully every day sit down and they have to write every day. That is not me. There are sometimes when I'm writing, and there are sometimes when I'm germinating, and sometimes when I'm researching, and sometimes when I'm just living my life. And that is okay. I've particularly had to be okay with that because I've had some chronic illness recently. And so, I've just had to be able to accept that. So I think find what works for you. If you are one of those people where it helps to sit down every day and know that you're going to do, X number of minutes, then go ahead. I sometimes lean away from doing word count. Some people that really works for them, but oftentimes I think it can be sort of falsely restrictive because sometimes what you really need to do to make progress in a novel is like delete an entire chapter. And, that doesn't really play into the word count thing. And a novel is not necessarily linear. It's really you kind of working out things in your mind. Even if it ends up being linear on the page, the way that writers progress through their work isn't necessarily linear. And so you may have to backtrack or you may have to redo something, and that still counts. So I would say keep in mind that no writing is wasted. Even if you've written 100 pages that you then have to delete, no writing is wasted. And it's all you sort of heading towards that destination, honing what it is that you want to say, experimenting, going down a wrong path, knowing it's a wrong path. I mean, there's real value in realizing, nope, that's the wrong path, because it clarifies where you do want to be going. My first novel, Song of Achilles, I had a completely finished draft, and I had even gotten a different agent, who was also wonderful, but I realized that the draft was no good. It wasn't actually what I wanted to be saying, and I ended up having to completely get rid of it and start over from scratch. No sentence from that original draft, which took me 5 years to write, remains in the novel Song of Achilles as it is now. And then it took me 5 years to completely overhaul it, but that's what the book needed. And so really give yourself the space to do that. And, it's also okay, though, sometimes to abandon a project. And that can be a really hard thing. Like, do I need to push through or do I need to abandon? And which is the right thing to do? And it can be very hard. During those 10 years when I was beating my head against the wall for Song of Achilles, there were lots of times when I thought, I have two other jobs that I love. I was a teacher and also a director. Why am I just, running into this brick wall with Song of Achilles? But the story kept bringing me back. I really wanted to tell this story. And I felt like I couldn't let the characters down and I couldn't let go of them. And so even though I suffered so many setbacks and it took me forever, and I was teaching myself how to write a novel on the fly as I was doing it, I kept coming back to the story. Whereas there was another novel I was working on that actually I have, hundreds and hundreds of pages of, that I realized, you know what? I actually am okay with letting this go. I don't need to. What I needed to do with this novel was kind of work out some ideas. A lot of the ideas were actually mixed up with Circe. It was also kind of about magic and witches and islands because it was inspired by Shakespeare's Tempest. And those ideas were kind of twisted up. And by writing about the Tempest, I was able to untangle them and sort of separate them into this belongs to Circe and this belongs to the Tempest. And actually, I'm okay, I've done it. I've done what I wanted to do with the Tempest. I learned something from it, and now I'm moving on. So I think trust yourself. What are the things that obsess you? What are the things that keep coming back and gripping your mind and won't let go? Go towards those things. The things that make you annoying to your friends because you can't stop talking about them, go towards those things. Those are the things that, that resonate and mean enough to you to stick with it. And, as I said, having a reader who can give you a bit of positive feedback at key moments is really, really helpful. Someone who believes in you, someone who says, keep going, I want to read this, finish it. It's really valuable to have people like that in your life, even just one person who says that to you. So yes, it can be very thankless to be working on a novel, but it's also really thrilling because you're, so keep going, but keep in mind that you're getting to create this world, and it is a form of wonderful play that you're going to then invite someone into.
Yeah, that's an awesome reminder for all of us to just keep trying, keep going, even when things can be tough for sure. And I know it's hard for a lot of people probably to kind of have to scrap some chapters or some projects. So I think knowing that that's been your experience can definitely inspire a lot of us to just remember to keep trying. So we also have a question from the Zoom chat from Monique Delachey. She says, as a writer, you are one of the authors who have inspired my work the most. What authors have inspired you to write and influenced your career?
Oh gosh. So many. And thank you. That means a lot to me. I loved some really formative writers for me were Amy Tan. I was completely blown away by The Joy Luck Club when I read it. I read that in high school, and it just changed the way I thought about novel writing and psychology. That really, I loved it so much. Isabel Allende, House of the Spirits. That was also a really meaningful book for me. I love Hilary Mantel, Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies. Those are amazing pieces of fiction. I forget which critic said about Hilary Mantel that she is always interesting. And I feel like that's really true, that her books are always really interesting. But actually, Hilary Mantel isn't interesting because I read Wolf Hall. And I don't know if I just wasn't in the right mind space for it. I kind of like my mind kind of like skipped off it. It kind of bounced off it. And then I went back and I read it again later because a friend really liked it. And I was like, oh, wow, this is amazing. But I totally missed it the first time. And I think that sometimes that happens, that, we're just not in the right space to connect with a book, or we just kind of don't thread the needle right, and we're not on the right track with it. That's a very mixed metaphor. But so giving the chance to go back and try a novel again if you didn't get it the first time. Julie Otsuka, The Buddha in the Attic. I mean, I think that The Buddha in the Attic is maybe like, I usually don't use the word perfect for novels, but I feel like it's perfect. I feel like it is just, it's like right at this meeting line between poetry and novels. I absolutely adore it. Margaret Atwood, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, these were all really, really formative writers for me. So while I was working on all these things in classics, at the same time, I was reading very contemporary authors. And I, had these kind of two parts. And I'm very glad that I had such a strong grounding in contemporary authors. And I still read all those authors a lot today, read and reread.
That's awesome. I'm sure we're gonna have to check out some of those authors. I've heard of some of them, but we'll definitely have to look at that comprehensive list for sure. We have another question from the Zoom chat from Hannah C. They say that sometimes Greek mythology can be very male dominant and it can be hard to find strong female characters. But I feel like you did such a beautiful job with Circe. Do you have any favorite female characters and is it hard to find their stories? I really like Psyche, Penelope, and Arachne personally.
Oh, those are all great characters. And I love Arachne. I wrote a big classics paper about Arachne and the Arachne episode in the Metamorphoses. And so I love that story. But I would say that the good news is you really can't go wrong with any of these characters, with any woman from mythology, because what you really want is, I mean, I think sometimes it can be very frustrating because we feel kind of hemmed in by the story. And so part of what was nice about Circe is she didn't end up like a lot of the big personalities of Greek mythology, the women like Clytemnestra, right, or Medea, right? She didn't end up dead or, in disgrace. She didn't have to be punished. And I'm thinking about Antigone too here, right? That she got to have a big personality and then she got to keep going. So I loved that. And I feel like that part of that is because she's a witch. So she could kind of get away with it. She had a little bit of leverage there. She had a little bit of power. She had access to some power that was, a little bit outside it. So that sort of connects to the witch side of her. Which I love about her. But although with Medea, it didn't work out quite so well. So I think one thing that can be hard when we're trying to take characters, particularly women characters from these stories, is that it can be hard knowing that their story is going to end in some sort of disaster that kind of closes their story down. I think that people oftentimes struggle when they're writing about Medusa with the same thing, right? It's like, this is going to end at the point of a sword unless I completely rewrite the story, or, that how do you write back when kind of the story puts you in a bind? And I would say that either you can just rewrite the story, right? You can slip through the narrative in some way. I think there are lots of writers that do that in really, really interesting ways, where you do just say, that's how people would like it to end, but this is how I would like it to end. But I think the other thing that you can do is you can pick characters that are maybe even not quite as well known. That there are lots of really, really interesting characters like Eurycleia from the Odyssey, who, we don't necessarily hear kind of what happens to them, and you do get to write their ending. And they aren't as, maybe as they may not have lions, and they may not be able to cast magical spells, but there's so many characters, and they're as complex as you want to make them, and they are as interesting and challenging and strong and complicated and flawed as you want to make them. And so I feel like you can just always keep in mind that when you're reaching into these stories, you are reaching into, by and large, storytellers who were male, and you are reaching into male heroic traditions, and you are reaching into mythology that was centering male stories, and you are allowed to pull women's stories out of that and change them and speak back. So, let your mind have the full range of what you want to do, both in terms of considering other side characters from mythology who might be just as interesting. And, yes, can you change an ending? Even if it's supposed to end at the point of a sword, can you change that? Absolutely, you can. You can change it.
I think that's also like a wonderful reminder to think about the lesser known characters, right? Because we all kind of think about the main ones that we hear about often. So I like that you kind of dialed that back in as well to think about additional female characters that might not be talked about as much. We have another question from the Zoom chat. Oh, actually, why don't we put it to the live audience really quickly? Um, we'll start with Haley. Yeah. So the question was, do you plan to continue writing Greek mythology, or do you have any plans to branch out into different genres?
Such a great question. For now, since I'm writing Persephone, I'm going to stay in the world of Greek mythology, but I would absolutely go wherever the stories take me. So I was thinking about doing The Tempest, because when I was a theater director, I directed Shakespeare plays. So I do have other loves out there, and I would go, including writing contemporary stories. That's actually where I started out. I didn't even get into my first novel, which I wrote in college, which was completely set in the contemporary world. The closest I got to it being connected to classics was that the main character was a Latin teacher in middle school. And I that novel will never see the light of day. It was my practice novel, but I would absolutely write in the contemporary world or in other sort of worlds. I love literary adaptation because it's such an enjoyable way to write back to stories I love, but also am frustrated with, but also love, but also am frustrated with. So I do love that genre, which I guess The Tempest would be different, but also still literary adaptation. So I would go wherever I am obsessed.
I love that. That's awesome. I think we'll take one more question from the live audience. I think Kelsey, yeah, had a question. No worries. Are you sure? Okay. Um, well then, why don't we move on to we'll pass it on to the classics department now. Thank you so much. I think that's all the time we'll have for the Reading the Rainbow section, but I'll pass things on to Jack and Jillian to moderate questions related to classics and the classics department.
Hello. Hello.
We just want to start by just thanking you for doing this. We're very grateful, and we're so fortunate to have this event. We also wanted to thank the John C. Roman Lecture Series and all the members of the board, particularly Mary Papuzzi as the chair, for working with Reading the Rainbow at UNH and helping to put this together. So we have a whole bunch of questions that have been sent in. We wanted to start with a fun one that we all like to discuss. Who's your favorite classical author that you read while in university?
Oh, I mean, I do think I have to say, Virgil. I was very fortunate to, this is like real nerd history here for me. But when I was in high school, I had a wonderful Latin teacher who taught me Greek as well as Latin. And he made a side comment in class, which, there are many, many amazing and brilliant Virgil scholars out there. But my teacher in high school believed, and he was like, well, everyone knows that the best Virgil scholar is Michael Putnam, and he's at Brown. And I was like, okay, go to Brown, is like what I wrote in my notes because I loved Virgil so much. Now, Michael Putnam is a genius, and I adore his work. As I said, there are many, many brilliant scholars working on Virgil. But I did, in fact, go to Brown and study with Michael Putnam, and that was a dream come true. And he was a mentor to me, and was really, really wonderful. and very supportive of my writing, although I was quite embarrassed to tell him that I was working on Song of Achilles, because I thought that I foolishly thought that my classics peers might think that it was silly, or might think that it was, frivolous or even blasphemous in some way. So I did not tell Michael Putnam, my professor at the time, that I was doing it. And when it was finally finished and I actually had like the Song of Achilles in my hand, I called him up and I said, I wrote this book about Achilles and Patroclus. Can I send it to you? And he said, well, I certainly hope you made them lovers. And I said, oh, I did. You're going to like it then. Okay, great. So reading that with him was amazing. But I loved all any poetry that I read, truly, I loved. I loved Catullus, obviously Homer. I read so much Homer. Those are such cliched answers, but that was what I loved.
So it sounds like you got both Latin and Greek early on. So can I ask, Greek or Latin?
Oh, it depends on the work. It depends on the work. They're both different. I couldn't choose. They're like, how can you choose?
Some of us can choose, some of us can't. Can I ask what your introduction to mythology was?
Sure. My mom was a librarian, among other things, and she loved mythology. And she decided when I was about 5 to start reading me little pieces from the Iliad and the Odyssey. I believe these were heavily edited, but she did read them to me, and I fell in love with the stories. I was so excited by how complicated and honestly how real they felt. It wasn't the fantastical elements that drew me in originally, although I came to love those as well. It was actually like Achilles being furious and throwing a huge tantrum. It was like the bad behavior. It was these incredibly big human emotions that were on display. And so I was very lucky to then have teachers who supported me, and I read everything I could about Greek mythology. And then as I said, I took Latin, and then I had this Latin teacher who taught me Greek. And I was able to go on a dig, an archaeological dig in Greece. So I had a lot of really fortunate things happen along the way, but it all goes back to my mother.
That's awesome. On the same theme of myth, we had a question about how do you, when you're researching and writing your books, navigate the differences in various mythological traditions, particularly between the Greek versions and the Roman versions of the stories?
So I sort of, when you are writing, I think that when you're writing a novel, I think that there is no rule except the rule that you make up for yourself. So I made up rules for myself because I did want to be consistent. So with Song of Achilles and also with Circe, I tended to make the Homeric version, kind of my bedrock. But if I didn't like it, or for some reason the story wasn't working for me, then I would go to other traditions and I would look to them. And I really went to what resonated the most with me. So for example, my Pyrrhus in Song of Achilles, my Neoptolemus figure, who's Achilles' son, is very, very much indebted to Virgil's version of him. So, a Roman portrait. I didn't go with the much nicer Sophocles version of him. I went with the Virgilian version because I thought that was really interesting. Here was a child who'd been raised by the gods. What would you be psychologically if you were raised by the gods? And I was like, well, maybe a sociopath. And a murderer who really didn't value human life at all, because that's sort of how I view the gods. So that the Virgilian version fit in better with other stuff. But I also allowed sort of little hints from all over the place to influence me. So there's this great Horace poem about Circe where he describes, it's not even about Circe, he just references her, and he describes her as Vitria, glassy Circe. And it's this really interesting description of her because, like, what does it mean? What does well, it's beautiful, right? It's rare, it's fragile. Maybe it's kind of like the sea, maybe it's like flat, like the sea, right? There's a lot of like associations that glassy. And so I kept thinking about like, what, Horace, what does that mean? And I, kind of played with that idea. And as I thought about how I wanted or when I wanted my Circe to be glassy, I thought about that time when she meets Odysseus and what she's like when she meets Odysseus and how Odysseus describes her as sort of this mysterious, like she's always kind of floating in, like looking awesome with amazing hair and being mysterious and then floating out again. And she's like golden and, we don't really know what she's thinking or feeling, but she's kind of perfect and, fixes everything for him after they become lovers, of course. And I thought, well, that's kind of glassy, right? It's like she's this smooth surface and you don't really know quite what's behind, and she's beautiful and she's rare, but maybe also like really fragile at the same time. So that idea, that Horace description of her really was in my mind as I was writing the scenes with her and Odysseus. It's sort of like that's how she wants to be, is this smooth surface, this beautiful, smooth, rare surface, but also we feel how breakable she is in that moment. She's at her most vulnerable also at that moment.
That's really interesting because there are so many times in translation where I'll kind of gloss over an adjective, where I'll just include it in my translation without really thinking about how that like deepens my understanding of a character. That's really interesting.
Well, thank you. I don't know if Horace meant that at all. I mean, I may just be taking Horace for my own purposes, and he might, hate it. But anyway, that's the wonder of getting to work with this stuff in sort of a novel form is that I can let these sort of different texts have conversations with each other. There was another, I'll give one more example. Sorry, I feel like I interrupted you, but I'll just give one more example. Which is, as I was thinking about Ovid's description of Circe as having an ingenium, an inborn temperament more fitted for love. And he means like romantic love, passionate love. But that idea of speaking like a human and the compassion that she shows Odysseus and having an inborn temperament more fitted for love and the fact that she's different from other gods, like all that sort of connected in my mind. And I definitely do not think that Ovid was referencing that idea. He's talking about something else entirely. But I love that this idea that her compassion and her empathy and her ability to feel love sets her apart from other gods and also kind of connects to her desire to love people. So anyway, I like how you can sort of connect these things psychologically, even if they aren't actually connected.
Speaking of Ovid, I have to ask the question, what would you give for Ovid's Medea? Or if you would give nothing, what ancient piece of literature do you wish we had?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I would love to have all of Sappho's poems, of course. I would love to have like the whole full thing. So I think if I had to choose, I would pick that over Ovid's Medea, but of course I would love to read Ovid's Medea. I think one of the things that's always astonishing to me is just how when we're looking at the ancient world, we're looking through a pinhole. And was so much out there, so much writing that just didn't come down to us. And we're so lucky to have what we have, but there was so much more. And we may find it, we may find pieces of it. That's the other thing. That's what's so exciting about classics to me too, is that, there are new discoveries and new things that we're getting to read and hopefully maybe one day we'll find one of those things. So, but I love in stepping into that mystery of what wasn't there. And I feel like that's a great jumping off point too for a novelist is, what were the stories that didn't make it, but that are out there.
Well, thank you for adding your voice to a discussion that we've had many times about what pieces we would wish would remain. Sort of transitioning a little away from the written text and onto other things that remain. We had a question about when you're doing your research and writing your books, how much do you take into account material culture, the sculptures, pottery, the artwork that remains behind, and how does that shape how you write your novels?
Quite a lot. I absolutely, particularly in Circe, most of the things that I was looking at, most of the objects that are mentioned in the novel were at least inspired by material finds that we have. Sometimes I played with them a little bit or adjusted them a little bit, but also I keep in mind that I am not writing historical fiction. I am writing in this sort of interstitial space, this mythological realism space, and that, there are these things in Homer that are anachronisms, right? Because it's like layers of oral tradition, and there's, just how rare is iron in Homer. It's a little unclear because we clearly have different layers of, and so I also sort of allow for some of that invention, some of the mythological things, some slippage. I mean, I thought a lot about this with the loom in Circe, because the loom that Daedalus gives her becomes an important piece of the story, part of her journey as an artist. And I did a lot of research into loom technology and sort of trying to figure out, well, what would the advanced version of that be? The sort of the metal that Daedalus uses for the Minotaur's cage, right? I was sort of like, well, does Daedalus invent steel? Maybe he does. Could Daedalus invent steel? Why not? Right? This is mythology. Maybe he could. I don't say it's steel, but he has invented some sort of alloy that is so I yes, I do try to keep material culture because I love it, very much at the forefront, but also I keep in mind that I'm writing in a mythological space, and I try to sort of allow that uh the actual historical record and then the mythological record to kind of touch each other there.
Okay. Well, on the topic of Daedalus, we had a question come into the chat about how do you decide to weave those aspects of the story that might not be originally part of a myth like Circe's, like the aspects of Daedalus in the story of the Minotaur. How do you decide which myths to add in and how to incorporate them?
So Daedalus is a figure that I find very moving. Again, probably influenced by the Virgilian Daedalus, just the few references of sort of the grieving father always really struck me. And I love that image of him from the Aeneid where he's tried to show his son's death and his hands fail and he can't because he's so overcome with grief. So for me, the grieving father and his fatherhood was really at the core of his character. And speaking of myths I left out, like the myth of him and murdering his rival and all, like, no thanks. That wasn't what was speaking to me about his story. So could you write a story about Daedalus that included that was really gripping? Absolutely, of course you could, but it just wasn't what spoke to me. So I knew I wanted Daedalus to be there because I knew I was telling the Minotaur story. And of course, Circe's sister is like such a delicious character, Pasiphae. I knew I wanted her to be there. So I thought, okay, well, we'll have a little Daedalus cameo here. And this is a great example of how, as a writer, you can't necessarily plan for everything. I really thought Daedalus was going to be a very, very small part. And then I wrote the Daedalus scene and I was like, well, I think I'm going to write another Daedalus scene. Then I wrote that scene. I was like, I think I'm going to write another Daedalus scene. And every time I wrote a Daedalus scene, I then wanted to write another Daedalus scene with Circe. And I think what I was realizing is that as I was thinking about it, to me, Daedalus and Circe are actually right next to each other. That Circe is the goddess who's almost human, and Daedalus is the human who's almost like a god with what he can do. And so they're right there next to each other, and they can kind of reach across that space. I think they're both artists. He's the first fellow like craftsperson artist that she meets, and her art, her witchcraft is really at the center of how I imagined her character. That to me, this was the story of a woman with a vocation. And her craft and her witchcraft was so integral to who she was. and that work that she does, which is so different. Most gods are just good at what they do automatically. They don't have to work, but her work and her dedication to her craft was so important, and his dedication to his craft. And so I thought, well, of course they would have a lot to talk about. And they also have encounters with monsters, and they both have guilt about those monsters. And so I realized that they had a lot to say to each other, and they were really significant figures to each other. And so he became kind of a pillar of the novel, or a really important figure, which I had no idea when I started writing those scenes.
Thank you. Your work has done so much, and as I'm sure you know, in bringing in the next generation of classicists, bringing people to the classics who otherwise wouldn't have really gotten an introduction. Was this one of your motivations in writing the Song of Achilles and Circe, or was it just like a fortunate byproduct?
It absolutely was. I mean, I love it. I love it when people tell me that they've read my book and then it brings them to read the Iliad or the Odyssey, or to get interested in the ancient. I mean, I always have my Latin teacher agenda, because I did in fact become a Latin teacher and a Greek teacher. And the other piece of it was that, working with students, so often students would come to class and they would think, this is boring. This has nothing to do with me. I don't want to be here. I feel alienated by this. And then as soon as they started learning the material, they were like, oh my gosh, this is like really intense and gripping and adult. And, and so it was always so exciting to see students go through that process, but also it was really powerful to see why people can feel alienated from this material. And I think there are good reasons why that happens. I mean, there's a long history of white supremacy in classics. There's a long history of gatekeeping in classics, right? There's a long history of saying, like, the people who are in the club who know this, there's a lot of classism, right? There's all this kind of stuff where this was like the prized cultural material, and if you knew it, you were allowed, and if you didn't know it, so I understand why people can sometimes feel very alienated by these stories, but I don't see the stories that way at all. I feel like these stories are, first of all, I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey, these came out of oral tradition. These were stories that bards were performing for audiences, that they were adapting and shaping over time, coming out of oral tradition, stories that grandparents were telling their grandchildren, right? These came out of a very democratic process, right? A process where people were shaping them as part of, how the audience was reacting to them was shaping how the bards were telling them. And so this was something that was happening in conversation. And they were for everyone. And so I always feel like I completely understand, and I want to honor why people feel alienated, but I also feel like that isn't what classics has to be. And I love that the new generation of classicists and so many wonderful classics professors out there are pushing back against that, and, really being honest about some of that history of classics, and opening up the field, and really listening for new voices and thinking about things in new ways. So all that was on my mind as I was writing. Yes, I love this material, and also I understand why people can feel frustrated by it.
Yeah, that's great, and I'm sure we all have our own teachers or authors or whatever it is that has helped us pull us into the fields that we love, and it's great that your books help students find that. But on the subject of you as a teacher, we had a question come in about what was your favorite thing to teach, either subject or something in the classics, or specifically, a grammatical point, or whatever it was that was your favorite to teach.
Oh my gosh. I mean, if we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty, I love teaching conditions. I don't know why. That was always one of my favorite things to teach. Loved that. I loved, I mean, any literature. Anytime I was teaching literature, I was just so happy. I loved talking about I feel like all I'm talking about is Virgil, but one of the things that was really powerful to talk to students about with Virgil is, like, this is a person who was born under a republic. I mean, not, a democracy, but a republic, and who died under basically a dictatorship, and lived through that change and had to write under that. And, how did that shape his perspective? Sort of looking at the way the history met the literature was always really interesting for me, and the context of how, particularly sort of the, the so-called golden age of Roman authors was responding to incredibly intense historical events that they were living through and witnessing, and quite dangerous times, and how that is reflected in their work. So I always really enjoyed teaching that. I mean, of course, I love teaching the myths. I oftentimes would just stop and tell myths sometimes in class. So that was a total indulgence on my part, but I loved doing it. I love the tragedies. I loved reading the Bacchae was always a favorite. I mean, always anyone who was a doubter, they would read the Bacchae and just immediately get get gripped in the story. So those were all favorites of mine.
Since you mentioned conditionals, I have to ask a question on behalf of Georgina. What is your favorite case in Greek or Latin?
Oh my gosh, my favorite case. Good question. I love those Homeric duels, right? Those are great. I mean, all of them. I love it all.
Professor Smith, do you have a comment on that?
No, sorry. Hi, by the way. Thanks for coming. I just wanted to reiterate on behalf of the John C. Roman Lecture Board for your graciousness in coming and answering questions like, "What is your favorite case?" That's a that's a tough one. I don't. I hope you don't mind me pulling you back into one of your books. But I work on Greek myth. It's what I do. I spend my days thinking about it, but not from the perspective you do. But I have to say that I thought that your portrayal of Odysseus and his voice and his character was about as good as it could have gotten. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how long did it take you to get, because it's like he's both slippery, but he's also like clever, but he's also like honest, and like it's an incredible kind of confection. So I wonder if you could talk about, you know, did you kind of take the Homeric version and work with it, or did you just take like the whole version? Just maybe talk about Odysseus because he's such an incredibly compelling character.
Oh, thank you. I'm really honored to hear you say that. He was one of my, I mean, I loved writing from Odysseus's, I loved writing his voice, not from his perspective, because the whole point was not from his perspective, but I loved imagining my way into him and his voice. And I feel like I had a little bit of an advantage because I had already worked with him in Song of Achilles. He appears in Song of Achilles at a much earlier stage in his life, and to a very different narrator. And so I liked getting to toy with the chameleonic nature that Odysseus has, that the way he presents himself to Achilles and Patroclus in Song of Achilles and the way Patroclus sees him is quite different from the way Circe sees him and the way he appears to her. But I wanted it to very much be the same person. Just at, having lived through the events of the Trojan War and, all that. So moving his character arc along, but also how different he can be depending on what he's called upon to do. I was very influenced by thinking about also his sort of PTSD. That was a piece of his character. I really appreciate the work of Jonathan Shea, Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America, where he sets up Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey against veteran narratives from Vietnam, and looking at the ways that, even though the ancients didn't necessarily have a word for PTSD, that they were absolutely writing about it and, certainly understood what it meant to live through horrors and to live through war. And also how there are certain people like Odysseus who are actually really thrive in those situations. Even though they're traumatic, they do really well in those situations because it sort of brings them fully alive. So I was thinking about all that. I was thinking about the contradictions of his character. The fact that I wanted my Odysseus to truly have a really interesting core that was honest. I do think he loves Penelope. And I think it's amazing in the Odyssey that he turns down immortality with Calypso. And she says, yeah, but you know your wife is going to be old. And he's like, it's okay. And he still wants to go home to Penelope. In that moment in the Odyssey too, where he sees Penelope kind of, schmoozing with the suitors, and he smiles because he laughs because he knows that she's just wrapping them up. He sees right through her because she's just like him. And he's not jealous and he's not threatened because he knows exactly who she is. And they have a real meeting of the minds, the two of them. And so I love these little moments where we see like this actual real deep connection to Penelope. And I wanted that in his character. And in order to have the type of connection he has to Penelope, I do feel like that he interacts with women in a different way than many of the other ancient sort of heroes do, that I wanted him to be able to see them in a more complex light than other ancient heroes do. But also, would he sacrifice them for his own purposes? Absolutely. But also he's so that sort of, and I was also thinking about how the Odyssey is, I think, in many ways, the most positive portrait of him from the ancient world, and it's still not that positive. And how many other versions of him, we see him as this very corrupt figure. But I think that certain people can bring out his softer side. And I think that there is something, I liked Circe sort of doing this dance with the parts of him that are very hard to get to know, the parts of him that are always sort of thinking and scheming, the parts of him that are also traumatized, and the parts of him that are also genuinely a little bit soft. But I then thought about, well, what would happen when he got home? And what would it be like when he was taken out of that sort of epic sphere where he was both tortured, but also thriving in his own way, and forced to live on like boring old Ithaca. And for that, I thought about Tennyson, and I thought about Tennyson's poem that, the famous poem, like to thrive, where he talks about Odysseus, who he calls Ulysses, is now home and he wants to go out adventuring again. It's to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, right? Drink life to the lees. It's this very inspiring poem about the human spirit and how you always want to go out and have another adventure. But I was like, boy, that person would be tough to live with, right? It's like, here's Telemachus and Penelope who've been like holding things together barely at home, and he comes home and then he's bored. And what that, so I wanted all that, and can he ever really go home again? And again, sort of thinking about like that PTSD that he's bringing, but also the fact that he's an incredibly ambitious person. And if you've tasted, the excitement and the adrenaline rush and the glory that Odysseus has tasted, can you then just go home and be the king of Ithaca? So anyway, all that was swirling around. But I wanted him to be as clever and as complicated and as conflicted as I feel like he really is.
That was all very enlightening, and I think I can speak for a lot of us to say that Odysseus was your presentation of him was much more complex and nuanced than I think than a lot of even in the original stories, and that was it was a great way to see him presented that like that. Changing topics a little bit, we had a question come in. Obviously, you have a command of the Greek and Latin, but for when you're doing your research, we had a question that was asking, do you have any preferred translations of the Odyssey and Iliad, and like what styles you prefer, whether closely sticking to the original text and literal translations, or more abstract, and how you go about finding your preferred version to read the stories in?
I love Emily Wilson. I'm a huge Emily Wilson fan. I think her work is so wonderful. I don't normally like to review books. I basically only want to write raves. So I usually say no when people ask me to review books, unless I know it's going to be a rave. But someone asked me to review Emily Wilson's Odyssey, and I very nervously said yes. because I wanted to, you know, support her work. And I read it, and I remember I was in the middle of reading, and I was like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Is Odysseus going to get out of this? And I was like, wow, she got me. Like I was totally in that story. Even though it's a story I know and have read, you know, hundreds of times. So I think she is amazing. And I really, one of the things I like about her work, and she particularly does this in the Odyssey, is that she keeps the same number of lines in the English as in the Greek. And I feel like that there is really something, whenever you're translating, you always have to make choices about what you're prioritizing. And I think, for the record, I think translating is way harder than novel writing, because you are literally making interpretive choices with every single word you choose. And you are having to then connect them to the next interpretive choice and the next interpretive choice. I mean, it's like, I don't know how it doesn't drive you completely, you know, wild. I feel like you could spend your whole life lost in a translation, trying to perfect it and trying to get every nuance and every little thing. So but I appreciate that she prioritizes speed, because one thing I think a lot of classic students have experienced is that like one line of Latin or Greek poetry suddenly becomes like 3 lines of English. And when that happens, it gets really bagged out and really slow. And I like that her translation moves, like, to me, it feels like Homer. It moves forward. It has that like propulsive excitement that, to me, the poetry does in Greek. So I really like that. I love that she prioritized that. And I really like, I also really like Anne Carson. I think she's a really, really interesting in the way she interacts with translating. I should have mentioned Autobiography of Red as as an early influence. I thought that was such an interesting piece. When I read it, it was very, very resonant with me. So I think with translation, but I love to read a lot of different translations, because I always think it's interesting to see translators talking to each other and talking to the material and seeing how they solve different problems. I would never, ever want to do a translation, because, as I said, I think it's way harder. And I think I would basically lose myself down a rabbit hole for the rest of my life. But I really appreciate the skill that translators bring to their work, and it's always really interesting to see. I love that there are translators that are pushing back against some of the kind of traditional translations of things. Again, sort of going back to Emily Wilson in the Odyssey, I like how she uses the word like slave as opposed to maids, just to keep in mind, right? Even though as classicists, we know that those maids are slaves, if you're not a classicist and you don't have that background, right, maid means something very different than slave. And that really colors how we look at what is happening to these women and why, you know, and how we feel about what happens to them. I mean, what happens to them is terrible, but it really adds another layer if we understand that they are enslaved.
Thank you for that. Opening it up to other people who want to ask a question, I have Carter's question from the chat. He asks, how or to what extent did your classical training interact with your own writing? He says he noticed the epithets in the Song of Achilles and was wondering if there were other hidden ways you interacted with classical literature, for example, or if you were worried about pushback from classicists, etc.
I thought a lot about similes. I love ancient similes, and similes and metaphors are a really important part of my work. And so they're always on my mind. I oftentimes think about genre a lot when I'm writing. So with Song of Achilles, I mentioned that first terrible draft that I got rid of. And part of what was wrong with it was actually that it was written in the epic genre. And I realized that that was completely wrong for what I was doing, that I was actually telling an intimate story. I was telling, you know, a love story. And so in order to really make the story Patroclus' story as I wanted, as I envisioned Patroclus, I needed to not use an epic voice. I need to use a lyric voice. And I needed to not draw from Homer and Virgil. I need to draw from like Sappho and Catullus, and sort of pull in the world of lyric poetry. And things needed to be about daily life and beauty and small things and small moments and funny interactions and, you know, all those little things that make up the world of lyric love poetry and lyric poetry. And so, you know, my Patroclus gets pulled into the world of epic because he loves Achilles, but that's not where he lives. He is from the world of lyric, and I wanted him to have a lyric voice. And so part of my rewriting it was realizing, so I was very much thinking about lyric authors and lyric subjects and lyric poetry and reading a lot of ancient lyric poetry as I was writing that, because that's the genre I was putting Patroclus in. With Circe, I was actually kind of doing the opposite. I wanted her voice to have like an epic resonant feel, because women oftentimes don't get to, you know, headline ancient epic. And so I wanted it to be an epic story. And the way I was kind of transforming it was, you know, I was taking a woman's life and putting it at the center of an epic story. And there was fate and there were gods and there were monsters and all that stuff, right, that you get in epic. But also, I wanted to take things that were traditionally not seen as epic and make them epic. So gardening, childbirth, right? Those types of things. And we get a little bit of craft as in epic with Penelope and her loom. But again, I wanted to kind of dive into that, into craft and to make that, to kind of make those epic. So for me, an epic voice for Circe felt important because I was taking a story that was not traditionally epic and making it epic. Whereas with Song of Achilles, I was taking a story that was traditionally epic and making it lyric.
That's awesome. I think about like genre and gender a lot, especially with like playing around with like Sulpicia and her elegies and how she kind of like co-opts the male genre of elegy. Anyway,
Yeah.
I think it's about time to open it back up to all participants since we're in the final 10 minutes. So if reading the rainbow, if you would like to come back. Thank you again.
Thank you. These questions are amazing. I am so honored to be speaking with all of you. Thank you for such thoughtful questions.
Yeah, thanks so much for opening up more Reading the Rainbow members. We do have a few questions in chat, but I just wanted to see if anyone live had a question that they wanted to ask. Yeah. Are there any strategies that you've developed that since you started writing that have helped your workflow, is the question.
Just keeping at it, reading wonderful books. Although I oftentimes don't read ancient retellings when I'm working on an ancient retelling, because I don't want that in my head, but just wonderful books in general. It's always inspiring to read an amazing book and to really love it and experience it. Seeing theater is always inspiring to me. Reading Shakespeare is always inspiring to me. So I think all those things, I think the main thing to keep work flowing is for me to not try to edit and create at the same time. That those are two very distinctive modes. And if I try to do them at the same time, it's like stepping on the gas and the brake at the same time. So you don't want to do that. You know, you create and you let all the stuff flow and you feel really excited about what you're writing. And then you stop and you step away and you come back and you edit it and you rip it to shreds. And then you stop and come back and create and joy and play and all that, and you put that away. And so you can't, you know, but I feel like if you have the critic talking as you're trying to create and play, then you're not ever going to get anywhere. So trying to keep those two different modes distinct. Yeah. Oh, also reading secondary sources is really helpful to me. When I get stuck, I love reading scholars arguing with each other. That is one of the most inspiring things to me, because I always find something new that I haven't noticed before, or something to agree with or disagree with, or get frustrated by, or feel like, oh yes, what an interesting insight. I hadn't even thought of it that way. So going back to the original sources, but also reading scholars is really, really like a key part of my process, and is always a good thing to do when I'm stuck.
That's awesome. Yeah, that combination I'm sure is helpful to consider also secondary sources, which I'm sure maybe might not come up for a lot of us. We may not immediately think of that um as as a resource. We also have a is there another in-person question?
Kelsey.
Oh yeah, Kelsey remembered her question.
What was your favorite part?
The question was from Kelsey, what was your favorite part of writing Circe and the Song of Achilles?
Um, it was getting to live in that world. I mean, this is a world I have loved for so long, and getting to um create these stories and really think my way through them was just it was joyful. And of course I was frustrated, and I had to write the Medea scene 50 times because Medea is a very intimidating character, and I wanted to make sure that I had my Medea that I felt good about, that made sense for my story. You know, but there's certain characters that are really, really tough to write about, particularly the big names that have been interpreted in lots and lots of different ways. I didn't really feel that way about Odysseus for some reason. I don't know why that is, but Medea really got to me. And my way into Medea was just really connecting with what a bozo I thought Jason was. And finally I was like, yes, I somehow that allowed me to get into Medea in a and how young Medea is, how really very young she is. Um, so thinking about all that, I mean, I loved writing. Um, sometimes I love writing the famous scenes, and sometimes I love writing the scenes that are not famous at all. I loved writing the Trigon scene uh, from Circe, and I didn't even realize it when I was writing it, but that is like clearly meant to be my catabasis, right? That's the journey to the underworld. I wasn't thinking about that as I was writing it. It was only after that I was like, oh, of course, this is the this is the confrontation with the otherworldly. This is her going down. But I I love when I'm suddenly on very mysterious ground and I don't really know what's going to happen. But also I love then writing a Minotaur C-section scene with a character like Pasiphae, who's just like amazing. She was such an interesting character to write, and I loved her and Circe as these antagonists and foils for each other because I wanted them to start off being very, you know, basically with Pasiphae as a villain, but also Circe eventually coming to understand her and why she chooses to live the way she chooses. Pasiphae wants to wield power in the world, and the only way you can do that as a woman is to, she thinks, terrify everyone else around you. And she and Circe are actually dealing with a lot of the same things, but they're just dealing with them in very different ways. And so that was the character I loved writing. With Song of Achilles, I was very intimidated to write some of the Chiron scenes because there is this moment as a writer where it's like, well, today I'm writing a centaur. And, you know, here I am writing my mythological realism. We've been really grounded in the realism, but now I have to make a centaur feel real. But once I started writing Chiron, it actually got the great teacher who teaches Achilles and Patroclus. It actually was very easy because Chiron is my homage to wonderful teachers. And I've had a lot of wonderful teachers. I've been very lucky. And he's not any one person, but just sort of this composite of this humanist, gentle, thoughtful, wise character. I loved writing Thetis, Achilles' mother. She was one of my favorite characters to write. I loved writing her. I think she and Circe would have a lot to talk about. She was never a villain in my mind, only an antagonist, very different things. So yes, I mean, all these were parts. I mean, what a joy to get to play in this material that I have loved my whole life. So all of it, really.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think we have time for maybe one more quick question from Clarissa. She asks, how does the difference in lyric and epic voice interact with the difference in first and third person voice?
Um, yes. Yes. So that is the difference, right? Is that
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Sorry.
yes, it is. It is. I mean, it's a great question. Um, So obviously with Patroclus and the lyric voice, it makes sense to go first person, right? It's that intimacy, it's that interiority. But I also really wanted Circe's eye um, to be correcting the record, right? It's correcting Odysseus's version, or pushing back against, maybe not correcting, but pushing back against, in conversation with Odysseus's version. And so I felt like the eye was really important because it's her asserting her personhood, that so often in the Odyssey she is, and in mythology in general, not just the Odyssey, she is really otherized. I mean, she's treated as this exotic, sort of motiveless person. I mean, Odysseus doesn't even ask her, or he doesn't tell us anyway. He doesn't even say, he's the most curious man in ancient literature, and he doesn't say, why are you turning men into pigs? He doesn't ask. Come on. Why doesn't he want to know what her interiority is like? And so that I felt really important in terms of reaching into her story and kind of pulling out her subjectivity, and giving her that agency and making her the center of the story. It felt like it had to be an I, because I really, really wanted her to speak for herself. And again, maybe this is my influence from theater, that to me, in some ways, my novels are monologues, right? They're one-person shows where the person is delivering the monologue of their life. But it felt so important. I mean, that is what I was really trying to do with Circe, is make her the subject of her story, and give her all that agency. And I tried to do that in big and small ways. And so the I was so integral to that, because it allowed us to see her objectifying Odysseus, right? Like, she thinks he's hot, and she thinks he's kind of this, like, and her deal, how she looks at his body as opposed to how he looks at her body in the Odyssey. And also, I mean, one of the big things, right? Circe of the beautiful braids is how she's described in the Odyssey, right? Her with her fancy hair, as if all she does is sit around waiting for someone to show up on her island in her like prom outfit. Whereas in my version, Circe braids her hair because she spends all her time in the woods with like lions and wolves. Of course, you'd put your hair up, right? That's practical. And so I wanted, with that I felt like I could really access that, like reaching into the things that Odysseus says about her, to mystify her, to otherize her, to objectify her, and pull that I out of it. So even though the I is not very epic, in the traditional sense, it felt important for this.
Absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful note to end on, to think about. Thank you again so much, Madeline, for spending the time with us today and sharing such meaningful insight into your work of in the world of mythology. I know we've all really gained a lot, being able to listen to your stories and your writing process and all of that. I know your stories continue to resonate deeply with so many of us, and it's just been a true gift to hear directly about you from all of your inspirations and your processes from that. And I just want to thank again, Clarissa Gowing for helping set up this event, as well as Joy Woolley for coordinating with Scott Smith in the classics department, and Liberty Larman for coordinating this as well and organizing all of this, as well as Jillian and Jack for moderating for the UNH Classics. It's been such a privilege to talk with you today, and I know everyone that's worked on this event has worked really hard, so it's been great to make this conversation happen. So thank you guys for that.
This was a huge joy. I want to thank you all for your incredibly hard work and for such a warm welcome. I have had so much fun tonight speaking with all of you. Thank you for such incredibly thoughtful questions. As a writer, it is an honor to be read so thoughtfully and with such care. So thank you.
And thank you so much for your thoughtful and insightful answers. Let's just give one last round of applause to Madeline Miller. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Perhaps for you too.
Have a great day.
Thank you.